So we've talked about some experiments looking at why faces might be special, and we've talked about some sort of formal models, some structural models about how people go from the face to the name, how people take that visual information and do stuff with it. Last week we talked about some neuropsychological evidence, what happens when, due to brain damage or disease, people stop to recognize objects, and what that might mean for our theories about how that's done in the brain. And we're going to do a similar kind of thing now for faces. So, based on what we've learned so far, what might we expect in some cases of brain damage? We've talked about how faces might be special, and we've talked about a model which kind of sort of starts to divide up some of the different stuff that we can do with faces and some of the different processes that we go through to analyze that visual information and come up with things like identity, expression. So what we would expect is that in some cases of brain damage, some of those processes, stuff to do with faces, are going to be damaged independently of some of the other stuff, independently of objects or independently of particular aspects of face recognition. And indeed, that's what we find, and that's what we call prosopagnosia. Okay? So remember, agnosia, we talked about the inability to recognize objects, particularly the inability to recognize objects by sight, not because people are blind or people need glasses, but because something has happened to the parts of the brain that allow us to take that visual information and match it to an object's name or an object identity. So prosopagnosia, coming from the Greek, I think, for faces, is a selective deficit for recognizing faces. So remember some of the things that we had to rule out when we were talking about visual object agnosia. It's not just a low-level visual thing. It's not because people don't know what a face is and what it should look like. And it's not because there's something wrong with the eyes. It's something specific to do with vision, and it's something which can be distinguished from visual object agnosia, at least some of the time. So sometimes people can't recognize anything, including faces. But there are plenty of cases where people can do just fine on other objects. They can still recognize chairs from tables and cats from dogs, but they're particularly impaired at recognizing faces. So they become unable to recognize their friends, their family, sometimes even themselves in the mirror. So it can be a very sad, sort of kind of a difficult impairment to live with. So the fact that it can be distinguished from object recognition, the fact that you sometimes get people who are impaired at objects but are fine with faces, and you sometimes get people who are impaired at faces but are fine with other objects, is kind of what we think of as a double dissociation. So you might have heard that term before. In neuropsychology, that's kind of the holy grail. We want to try and find a double dissociation. What does that mean? It means when somebody is impaired at one thing but spared on the other, and a different group of patients shows the opposite pattern. And that's nice, convincing evidence that there's two different parts of the brain or two different brain mechanisms involved which are actually separable. So it's not just because face recognition is harder and it's what goes wrong first. It's because there's two different things happening. So in a double dissociation, what we normally want to do is we want to show that there are two groups of people. There's a group who are good at task A, whatever that might be, and bad at task B. And there's another group that show the opposite pattern. Another group who are good at task B, but bad at task A. So it's not just that task A is easy, because group 2 can't do that. It's that there's something specific, there are specific mechanisms which are impaired here, and there are specific mechanisms which are impaired here, and those mechanisms are different, dissociable, separable. So in our case, we can think about prosopagnosia, we can think about object agnosia as going some way towards a double dissociation. So prosopagnosics, at least pure prosopagnosics, are okay at objects, good at objects, but bad at faces. And object agnosics can be very bad at objects, but okay at faces. So there's this kind of dissociation. Again, think about, we were talking about a functional dissociation when we were looking at experiments, and this is more of a neuropsychological double dissociation. So it's a nice way for us to say, okay, this is good evidence that something special is happening with faces in the brain. Prosopagnosia, just like agnosia, most cases come about because of stroke, because of selective brain damage in parts of the visual cortex. Sometimes people have other sorts of cerebral accidents. And there's recent interest in developmental as well as acquired causes. So what do I mean? I mean, not everybody who gets it had brain damage because of an accident. Some people seem to grow up at being specifically poor at faces. So there's a bit of a debate in the literature about whether these things are the same, whether developmental prosopagnosia really exists and what it means. But there's a lot of interest in it at the moment. They're sort of talking about incidence of up to 5%, which means that there'll be several people in the room who maybe they don't realize it, but are actually very, very bad at recognizing faces. So if you're somebody like that, you might want to look into it. So there's a suggestion that some people grow up or show a developmental type of prosopagnosia that mean they're selectively impaired at recognizing faces. And as we'd expect, if this is all tied into specific mechanisms to do with grouping the facial features together, to do with treating faces as a whole, there's evidence that people who have prosopagnosia don't show the same sort of effects that we talked about earlier in the lecture. They don't show the holistic processing that seems to be the hallmark of faces. The inversion effect might not apply to these patients. So what does that suggest? It suggests that what they're doing to faces and other objects, to faces that are the right way up and which are inverted, seems to be the same. So unlike normal people who treat faces the correct way up very differently, they seem to be treating everything the same. Perhaps they're doing more of a sort of a piece-by-piece recognition of a face rather than a holistic configural recognition, which healthy people seem to do. So here are a couple of quotes from a neuropsychological book about what it's like to have prosopagnosia. The first patient says, "I can tell the difference between a man and a woman from across the street, but I failed to recognize the face of an old friend and I mistook my mother for my wife." Awkward. Somebody else says, "Two people, one of them could be my wife because of the silhouette." This is when he's looking at a photo. "One of them could be my wife because of the silhouette. If it is my wife, the other person could be me." And it was their wedding photo. So they're sort of using outlines, using silhouettes, maybe using other cues, but they're showing a severe impairment in terms of actually recognizing facial identity. So there are some other interesting hints in those quotes, like the one at the top. He says he can tell the difference between a man and a woman, but he can't recognize a specific woman. So maybe that's something interesting as well. Maybe that starts to show the different sorts of information we can get from a face and how those different things might be represented. So maybe the features we use to do man versus woman are intact in this person. Maybe he's using clothes like hair and clothes, but he can't do specific identity. So a lot of patients can kind of get by, and developmental prosopagnosics may develop different sort of strategies. Maybe they get very good at telling people by their voice or by the way they walk or by what kind of clothes they wear. So some of them develop this kind of strategies, and a lot of us can do that kind of stuff. But when you actually test them and show them two photographs or two, if you sort of eliminate those cues, they're very, very bad. So, like I said, we should think about this neuropsychological evidence in terms of the models that we've learned about. What do they say about the way that normal people recognize faces? Well, we can think about the difference between detection and recognition. So most of these patients are able to detect a face. So if I showed you a picture of a face and something that isn't a face and said, which is the face, they can do that. They know where the face should be. They know that it's a face. So they're able to detect the face. They're able to sort of identify the features and say, yep, their noses and eyes, and that's a face. But they can't recognize it. So maybe that means that the stages in the sort of Bruce and Young type model, which are impaired in prosopagnosics, are a bit later on. Maybe they're a bit more like associative agnosia than apperceptive agnosia, where there's something basic going on to do with the visual features. It doesn't seem to be that because they can detect faces. Maybe prosopagnosia can tell us something about familiar versus unfamiliar faces. We saw that Bruce and Young kind of make an important distinction between those types of faces. Their model deals with familiar faces that we already have a kind of a template for. Prosopagnosics don't seem to be able to do that in the same way, but sometimes they do manage to learn faces. Sometimes they do manage to recognize people that they're very familiar with. So I showed you extreme examples where people couldn't recognize their wife, but more common, they'll forget people who are reasonably famous, but they'll remember people that they see every day. So maybe some of the activation in that sort of network is still there. Maybe there's still some strong activation for people they know very well, who are very familiar. Or maybe they can use the other parts of that network, remember the stuff to do with who this person is, to cue them. Maybe they hear somebody speaking a British accent singing a Beatles song, they can go from that semantic information to the name rather than having to say, yeah, it's John Lennon, it's Paul McCartney. So we can think about familiar and unfamiliar faces. And we can think about the other pathways in the model, the pathways to do with identity and expression. So according to Bruce and Young, these are two different sorts of things that we do with the information. And there's some evidence that there are at least some prosopagnosics who can do facial expression just fine. They can say that person's happy, that person's sad. They just can't say if that person's their wife or their mother. They can't say if they recognize the particular identity of that face. So that's good evidence for what Bruce and Young said about there being two pathways in terms of identity and expression, in terms of being view-dependent and view-independent sort of representations of the visual stuff that makes up a face. So that's how you should think about this kind of neuropsychological evidence. How can it inform us about the stuff that normal people do and the way this we might sort of build a model of how people can do it and how it's represented in the brain. So here's that model again. Maybe we could point to a particular part of the model which is impaired. Maybe we could say, well, when you're prosopagnosic, maybe something's happening to the face recognition units or to this bit of the model which would leave expression analysis and some of the other stuff intact. So maybe we can start to scrub out some of these boxes and produce a model for what's happening in a neuropsychological disorder like prosopagnosia. So another sort of interesting aspect of this, which I touched on before the break, is what we call covert recognition in prosopagnosia. So prosopagnosics can't recognize faces explicitly. If you ask them who is this person, they won't be able to tell you. But sometimes they show what we call covert recognition, which means that even though they can't produce the name, if you force them to guess, they actually do so better than chance. Or they might show semantic priming effects. Remember we talked about semantic priming effects? So they might not be able to tell you that it's Cheryl Cole or David Beckham or Simon Cowell, but they might still get faster if you show Cheryl Cole and then Simon Cowell. Okay, so remember that was what semantic priming was. You can be cued by the semantic relationship between two faces. So even though they can't explicitly tell you who this person is, they might still show this kind of semantic priming effect. And if you ask them to try and learn faces which are famous, like you give them some kind of learning task, it turns out that they can learn those faces better than faces which aren't famous. So there seems to be something residual which is still there, something which allows them to do that kind of recognition. More specifically, there was some famous experiments where they showed, again, looking at this skin conductance measure that we talked about was a kind of an emotional response to faces. There were experiments showing that although prosopagnosics couldn't recognize a familiar face, they still showed the emotional response associated with that effect, with that face. So if you showed them somebody nice or somebody nasty, or somebody who was close to them, who's maybe a loved one, then they would show that emotional response, that skin conductance response, and they would show a greater one to people that they knew, even though, if we ask them explicitly, they can't tell you who they are or whether they know them or not. So this kind of suggests that there is something else which is intact, which is still there in prosopagnosia, which is preserved, and that might be this sort of second pathway in face recognition. So remember, I showed you this before the break, another extension to that model, this emotional route B. So one of the reasons that they proposed this was because prosopagnosics seem to be able to still sort of feel these kind of emotions, even though they can't do the explicit stuff in the purple box. So they seem to be able to detect something about the emotion or something about the emotional attribution that people give to a face. So that is what we might call a dissociation. We've got a patient who can do A, but they can't do B. In this case, they can do emotional recognition, if you like. They can show an emotional response, but they can't do an explicit response. So that's a single dissociation. We've got one group of patients. If we wanted to make this sort of argument much more strong, what we really want is a double dissociation. We want somebody who does the other way round, right? Who can recognize the face, but doesn't show the same emotional response. And it's been proposed that there are some patients like that, and that they are patients with what's known as Capgras delusion. So Capgras delusion is a very bizarre neuropsychological disorder, which is rare, and it's called a delusional misidentification syndrome, which means that basically people recognize somebody but believe that they've been replaced by an imposter. Okay? So here's another quote about Capgras. Mrs. D, a 74-year-old married housewife, received the diagnosis of atypical psychosis because of her belief that her husband had been replaced by another unrelated man. She refused to sleep with the imposter, locked her bedroom and door at night, asked her son for a gun, and finally fought with the police when attempts were made to hospitalise her. At times, she believed her husband was her long-deceased father. So it's been proposed that this kind of bizarre disorder, where people kind of recognize the face, they admit that this person looks exactly like their husband, but they believe they've been replaced by an imposter, or they misidentify them as somebody else. And it's been proposed that that is because in Capgras disorder, although face recognition is intact, the emotional response, the emotional attribution that they're expecting from that person has been removed. And it's been proposed that those sorts of patients don't show the same kind of skin conductance response that normal participants show and that prosopagnosics show. So it's been proposed that there might be this kind of double dissociation between Capgras delusion and prosopagnosia. So between prosopagnosia, where they can't recognize faces, but they still show this kind of emotional response, the face sort of feels familiar, and Capgras delusion, where they recognize the person all right, they recognize the features, but it doesn't, something feels weird, doesn't feel right. Okay? So it's been proposed that this provides evidence for this kind of emotional affective route being intact in one group of patients, but being impaired in the other group. Okay, so we talked a bit about prosopagnosia, and the question that we've kind of returned to in all this research is, how are faces special? And are faces special? And I've shown you quite a lot of evidence that says that they kind of are. So we're going to think about whether that means that there are specialized brain mechanisms for faces, or whether maybe there's another explanation for why faces seem to be processed in a special way. Okay, so the evidence we've looked at so far, we looked at those effects, we looked at how faces seem to be disproportionately affected by turning them upside down. We looked at how research shows this kind of the part whole and the composite effects about how we put the features together in an obligatory fashion. And we've talked about prosopagnosia and the possible double dissociation, which shows that something specific happens in the brain which can go wrong, which is specifically to do with processing faces. So there's also quite a lot of research, quite a lot of evidence from cognitive neuroscience from looking at the brain, looking at the functions of the brain while people are doing tasks, and which are associated with particular cognitive tasks. So there's quite a lot of research showing that we do indeed have a specific part of the brain. And the evidence suggests that there's a specific part of the brain called the fusiform gyrus, which has also been called the fusiform face area, the FFA. So here are a couple of fuzzy brain scans. The one on the left is a view from the top, right? It's a sagittal slice where we've kind of lopped off the top of somebody's head and looking down. We haven't really done that, it's a scan. You've got two FFAs in each temporal lobe. It's a structure within the temporal lobe. This is a view from the kind of the back of the brain, showing kind of how far down the temporal lobe it is. So it's been proposed that there's this fusiform face area which lights up, which activates preferentially when we ask people to look at faces or when we ask people to recognize faces. And it's been proposed that this is really specific for faces and that this might underlie the reason that we seem to treat faces differently. It might be a part of the brain which is associated with that other behavioral evidence that we've looked at. So here's one example of many experiments where they've looked at the FFA. And in this experiment, the kind of interesting thing is that they tried to compare lots and lots of different categories of image. So what Downing and colleagues did was they put people in a brain scanner, they showed them pictures, and they looked at which parts of the brain were active. And in particular, they looked at this region, the FFA, and said, how active is it? And they compared all these different types of categories. So they said, well, we want to rule out that it's not anything else. So they looked at animals, they looked at bodies without faces, they looked at cars and furniture and weird animals and insects and fruit and scenes and all these different things, which a lot of these categories share a lot of features with faces. They're all sort of colourful, they're all natural, they've all got the same sorts of features. And then they just looked at the activation in the FFA, in the right FFA, because you've got two, remember, you've got two, one in each hemisphere. And this bar at the end, the last bar, is the activation shown to faces. So across all these categories, the biggest activation in the FFA was to faces. So they said, it really is specific to faces. There's something about faces that really trigger this part of the brain and that suggests that we've got a specialized bit of the brain for doing faces. So the reason that the choice of category here is quite important is that we've already sort of said that faces are a special type of stimulus because of the subtle distinctions, because of the configural processing that is required to recognize an individual's face. So it's been argued that it's very difficult to actually find a good control stimulus which is going to tap into the same types of processing that we use for faces. So maybe it's not really fair to say this is a face area. Maybe it's just an area which is good at configural processing, good at features laid out in a particular way. So one study that tried to sort of rule this out was this study by Yeovil and Canwisher. So Nancy Canwisher is the person that sort of discovered the FFA and that has produced a lot of work about it. So they tried to use a different control stimulus, namely a house or a group of houses. So they made a direct comparison between people recognizing faces and people recognizing houses. So in the sort of the test phase, you had to learn a series of faces or a series of houses. And then you had to sort of, we tested how good you were at recognizing those faces. And we can do so either by changing the parts, changing the nose or the eyes, or by keeping the same parts and just changing the distance between the features, sort of moving them further apart. And we can see how well people do and how well the FFI is activated. But importantly, they did the same thing with houses. So they said they took houses and they took the windows, they took the doors, they took the roof, they took the chimney, same sort of features, just like eyes and nose, same features, and they changed the parts or they changed the configuration. So they tried to get the closest control as they could. And they still found that the FFA, the activation in the FFA was higher for faces than it was for houses, even though we're using the same kind of, presumably we have to use the same kind of processes, the same kind of configurable processes to do this task. There's something about the faces that made the FFA light up. And as we'd expect from this, in prosopagnosia, if we look at the damage that these patients have sustained through stroke or brain injury, if we try and look and see what's gone wrong in those patients, it turns out that the damage in those patients almost always includes these regions. So neuropsychology tends to be a bit messy. There's often a lot of different damage. It's quite rare to get somebody who has only got a problem with faces. Often they've got other problems to do with memory or to do with coordination or to do with speech. But one of the common factors, if you look at lots and lots of people who have this disorder, the common factor is that it tends to